The rain pounded against the windshield of the black Suburban as it pulled up to the grand entrance of the Hotel Magnolia in downtown Dallas. The historic building stood tall and proud, its Art Deco architecture illuminated by strategically placed lights that cut through the dismal weather. It was just past 11 at night, and George Strait let out a weary sigh as he gazed at the ornate facade through the rivulets of water streaming down the car window. "Some night, huh?" Mike Daly said, from the driver's seat, his weathered hands still gripping the steering wheel. The 67-year-old guitarist had been with George since the beginning, a founding member of the Ace in the Hole band that had backed the King of Country for over 4 decades. "Good cause, though," George replied with a tired smile. $200,000 for those flood victims, worth every minute up there. The benefit concert had gone an hour longer than planned, with George performing several encores at the crowd's insistence. At 70 years old, he could still command a stage like few others in the industry, his rich baritone voice seemingly untouched by time. I hope y'all are enjoying this story as much as we enjoy sharing it with you. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life stories that touch the heart. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in George's situation? And let us know where you're watching from. Now back to our story about the legendary George Strait. As their car door was opened by the valet, George pulled his worn Texas Rangers baseball cap lower over his brow. Without his signature resistol cowboy hat, pressed shirt, and tailored Wrangler jeans, he looked remarkably ordinary, just another older gentleman in casual clothes arriving at a hotel late at night. His faded blue jeans had seen better days, and his scuffed boots bore the marks of real ranch work, not just stage performances. "You sure you don't want me to grab the bags?" Mike asked, handing the car keys to the young valet. "No, I got it," George replied, reaching for his simple overnight bag. "It's just one night. You go on and get some sleep. I know your back's been giving you trouble." Mike nodded gratefully. They had been traveling light for this quick trip, just the two of them without the usual entourage that accompanied George's major tours. The benefit show had been organized on short notice after devastating floods had displaced hundreds of families across East Texas the previous month. The doorman held open the heavy glass door as they entered the hotel's opulent lobby. The Hotel Magnolia had been renovated to the tune of $20 million just 2 years prior, reclaiming its status as one of Dallas's premier luxury accommodations. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, casting a warm glow over marble floors and plush furnishings. A baby grand piano sat in one corner, unattended at this late hour. George noted a small crowd of people near the check-in desk, mostly men and women in business attire, likely attendees of the technology conference that was also taking place in the hotel this week. They looked tired, but were chatting animatedly, some with drinks in hand from the lobby bar that remained open to accommodate late arrivals. "You go on up to your room, Mike," George said. "I'll get us checked in." "You sure?" Mike asked, stifling a yawn. "Positive. That shoulder needs rest, not more luggage hauling. I've got this." Mike reluctantly agreed, knowing that when George made up his mind, there was little point in arguing. That quiet determination had carried the singer through decades in an industry that chewed up and spat out most artists after a few years. As Mike headed toward the elevator, George approached the front desk, where a young man in an impeccably tailored suit was typing rapidly on a keyboard. His name tag identified him as Trevor Williams, night manager. Trevor's dark hair was styled in what George's granddaughter would call an undercut, short on the sides and longer on top, and his face bore the concentration of someone who took his position very seriously. "Good evening," George said with the polite Texas drawl that had charmed audiences for decades. Trevor looked up briefly, his eyes making a quick assessment of the man before him, noting the worn jeans, old boots, and baseball cap, before returning to his computer screen. "I'll be with you in a moment, sir," he replied curtly, continuing to type. George patiently waited, removing his cap and running a hand through his silver hair. The day had been long, and he could feel every one of his 70 years in his bones. The additional hour of performing had taken more out of him than he cared to admit, though he'd never regret it. Those families needed help, and if his name on the marquee could fill seats and raise money, he was happy to give his time and energy. After nearly 2 minutes, Trevor finally looked up again, his expression professionally neutral but tinged with something less welcoming. "How may I help you?" he asked, his accent distinctly East Coast, New York or perhaps Boston, standing out sharply against the Texas drawls that filled the lobby. "I have a reservation," George said. "Name's George Strait." Something flickered across Trevor's face, confusion followed by skepticism. He turned to his computer and typed the name, George Strait. Trevor repeated flatly as he scrutinized the screen. "I'm not seeing any reservation under that name." "Should be there," George replied easily. "My manager confirmed it yesterday. 2 rooms." Trevor's eyes narrowed slightly as he continued scrolling through the system. "Nothing under Strait. Are you certain you have the right hotel? This is the Hotel Magnolia." "Yes, sir, I'm certain," George said, with the patience of a man who had dealt with far worse inconveniences in his life. "My friend Mike Daly just went up, assuming his room would be ready." Trevor's posture stiffened. No one should be going up without checking in first. That's against hotel policy. He raised his voice slightly, causing a few nearby guests to glance over. "What room did your friend go to?" "Well, I don't rightly know yet," George admitted. "That's why I'm here checking in." The night manager's expression darkened further. "Sir, we have no reservation under the name George Strait." His tone had taken on an edge that carried across the marble-floored lobby, or Mike Daly, for that matter. By now, several of the business conference attendees had turned to watch the interaction, their interest piqued by the increasing tension. A woman in a charcoal business suit nudged her colleague and whispered something, both of them glancing curiously at George. "Maybe check under Norma Strait," George suggested, mentioning his wife's name. "Or it might be under Irv Woolsey Management." Trevor let out an exaggerated sigh and made a show of checking again. "Nothing under those names either." He looked directly at George now, his voice carrying even further. "Sir, this is a luxury hotel. Our rooms start at $400 per night. Perhaps there's been some confusion." George met the young man's gaze steadily. "Son, I understand. But there shouldn't be any confusion. The reservation was confirmed." Trevor's jaw tightened at being called son by this seemingly ordinary older man in worn clothing. He straightened his designer tie and spoke loudly enough that half the lobby could hear. "Sir, we have no record of a George Strait staying at this hotel." His tone had grown increasingly condescending. "And I think I would know if the country singer George Strait was booked here." A few people in the lobby chuckled, and George noticed a young woman raising her phone, possibly recording the exchange. It wasn't the first time he'd been unrecognized in casual clothes, and normally he appreciated the anonymity. Tonight, however, the exhaustion of the benefit concert left him with little patience for the developing spectacle. "Look, there's clearly been a mix-up," George said, keeping his voice measured. "Could you please check with your manager or see if the reservation might be under another name?" Trevor's expression hardened. "Sir, I am the manager on duty. There is no reservation." He glanced pointedly at George's attire. "And frankly, if you're trying to claim you're George Strait to get special treatment, that's not how we operate here." The lobby had grown quieter now, with more eyes turning toward the confrontation at the front desk. George could feel the stares, but kept his focus on resolving the situation without creating a scene. "I'm not claiming anything to get special treatment," George replied evenly. "I'm just trying to check into my room after a long night." "A room you don't have reserved," Trevor countered, his voice rising further. "Look, sir, I don't know what game you're playing, but the real George Strait wouldn't show up looking like—" He gestured dismissively at George's casual attire. "This. And he certainly wouldn't be traveling without an entourage or advance. Notice to the hotel." Mike had returned to the lobby, having realized something was wrong when his keycard didn't work. He approached the desk with concern etched on his face. "Everything all right, George?" he asked, glancing between his longtime friend and the increasingly hostile hotel manager. "Ah, and this must be your bandmate," Trevor said with unmistakable sarcasm. "Let me guess, Garth Brooks, Willie Nelson." Mike blinked in surprise at the hostility, then turned to George. "What's going on here?" Before George could answer, Trevor interjected. "What's going on is that your friend here is claiming to be George Strait, presumably to try and get free accommodations." "But he is George Strait," Mike said, confusion evident in his voice. Trevor rolled his eyes dramatically. "Right, and I'm Taylor Swift." This elicited laughter from several onlookers who had gathered to watch the unfolding drama. A woman in designer clothing who had been standing nearby stepped forward, her phone held up horizontally as she recorded the encounter. "This is going to be gold on TikTok," she said to her companion. "Country bumpkin tries to play celebrity." George felt a flush of embarrassment, not for himself, but for the young manager who was digging himself into a deeper hole with each passing moment. He'd experienced far worse in his life. The devastating loss of his 13-year-old daughter in a car accident had given him perspective on what truly constituted hardship. This was merely an inconvenience, albeit an increasingly public one. "Mike," George said quietly, "why don't you try calling Irv and see if he can straighten this out?" As Mike stepped away to make the call, Trevor continued his public dressing down. "Sir, I suggest you stop this charade before I'm forced to call security. We have actual paying guests who deserve my attention." The gathering crowd had grown to nearly 20 people, most of them conference attendees who had been having drinks in the lobby bar. Several had their phones out now, recording the confrontation. George could hear snippets of their commentary. "Poor old guy. He probably really believes he's George Strait. This is sad, actually. He might not be all there mentally. The night manager is being kind of a jerk, though." George maintained his composure, though the muscles in his jaw tightened slightly. In his 4-decade career, he'd encountered all types, from the most gracious fans to the rudest industry executives. He'd learned that reacting with anger rarely solved anything. "Is there someone else I could speak to?" George asked calmly. "Perhaps someone who's been working here longer." Trevor's face flushed at the implied criticism. "Sir, I've been in hotel management for 6 years. Before Dallas, I was at the Ritz-Carlton in New York City. I think I know how to handle check-in procedures without assistance." "I'm not questioning your competence," George replied, "just suggesting that someone who's been here longer might recognize me or know about the reservation." "Oh, I recognize that you're trying to pass yourself off as George Strait," Trevor said loudly, clearly playing to the audience now. "But people like you don't understand how establishments like this work. We cater to distinguished clientele who make proper reservations and don't try to name-drop celebrities to get free rooms." A middle-aged couple nearby whispered to each other, the woman looking increasingly uncomfortable with Trevor's behavior. A businessman in an expensive suit frowned disapprovingly at the spectacle the night manager was creating. As the tension in the lobby reached its peak, the elevator doors opened, and an older woman in a hotel housekeeping uniform emerged, pushing a cart laden with fresh towels. She was in her mid-60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her dark skin etched with the lines of someone who had seen much in life. The name Eleanor was embroidered on her uniform jacket. She glanced over at the commotion by the front desk, her eyes widening as they landed on George. For a moment she stood frozen, then a broad smile lit up her face. Abandoning her cart, she walked across the lobby with purpose, ignoring Trevor's continuing tirade. "Oh, my stars," she said as she approached, her voice carrying the deep warmth of a lifelong Texan. "It can't be. Mr. George Strait himself, standing right here in our lobby." The lobby fell silent as Eleanor approached George, her face radiating pure joy and admiration. She stopped a respectful distance from him, clasping her hands together, as if she couldn't quite believe her eyes. "Mr. Strait, I have been listening to your music for over 40 years, she said, her voice filled with emotion. "My late husband Robert and we danced to Amarillo by Morning at our 30th anniversary party just before he passed. That song was playing when he proposed to me back in '78. George's expression softened immediately. He removed his baseball cap and extended his hand to the housekeeper with genuine warmth. "It's a pleasure to meet you, ma'am," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "What's your name?" "Eleanor Thompson," she replied, taking his hand with reverence. "I've worked here at the Magnolia for 32 years now. Never thought I'd meet you in person, though I've been to 6 of your concerts." Trevor watched this exchange with growing horror, his face draining of color as the realization dawned on him. The whispers in the lobby had shifted dramatically, with guests now pointing at George with recognition rather than derision. "That really is George Strait. Oh my God, I didn't recognize him without the hat. Trevor just humiliated George Strait." Eleanor turned toward Trevor, her friendly demeanor hardening into something more protective. "Trevor Williams, what are you doing making Mr. Strait wait out here in the lobby like this? This man is Texas royalty." The night manager's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the magnitude of his error. The phone at the desk rang, but he seemed incapable of movement, frozen in the headlights of his impending professional disaster. A woman in her 50s broke from the crowd, approaching with an apologetic smile. "Mr. Strait, I'm so sorry I didn't recognize you earlier. My husband and I have been to your concerts at least a dozen times." She held up her phone. "Would you mind taking a quick photo?" Before George could respond, another guest approached, and then another. Within moments, he was surrounded by admirers, many apologizing for not recognizing him sooner and for the treatment he'd received. Mike returned from making his call, eyebrows raised at the sudden change in atmosphere. Trevor stood behind the desk, watching his career implode before his eyes. He had only been at the Hotel Magnolia for 3 months, having moved from New York specifically for this position. Growing up in Manhattan, country music had always seemed like a foreign concept to him, something for rural communities, not sophisticated urbanites. He'd scoffed when his Dallas friends insisted he familiarize himself with country legends, if he was moving to Texas. Now, that arrogance was costing him dearly. As the crowd around George grew, a distinguished man in his 60s emerged from the hotel bar, quickly assessing the situation. Charles Harrington, the Hotel Magnolia's general manager and a 30-year veteran of the hospitality industry, immediately recognized the famous singer at the center of the gathering. His face paled when he glanced at Trevor, putting together what must have happened. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles announced in a commanding voice that carried across the lobby. "While we're all thrilled to have Mr. Strait as our guest tonight, I'm sure he's exhausted after his benefit concert. Perhaps we could give him some space." The crowd reluctantly began to disperse, though many lingered nearby, stealing glances at the country legend. Charles made his way to the front desk, placing a firm hand on Trevor's shoulder. "Mr. Strait," Charles said, with the practiced charm of a veteran hotelier, "I cannot express how honored we are to have you staying with us. I'm Charles Harrington, the general manager. I understand there's been some confusion with your reservation." George nodded, replacing his baseball cap. "Seems to be. My manager confirmed 2 rooms yesterday." Charles shot Trevor a look that promised a serious conversation later. "Of course, I'm certain we can sort this out immediately." He turned to the computer and began typing, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Ah, here it is. The reservation was made under Irv Woolsey management, but it appears there was a system error that prevented it from displaying properly. He looked pointedly at Trevor. Something that could have been discovered with a more thorough search. Trevor's face had gone from white to bright red. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he stood rigidly beside his superior, aware that dozens of eyes were still watching the scene unfold. "In fact," Charles continued smoothly, "we'd like to upgrade you to our presidential suite at no additional charge, Mr. Strait. It's the least we can do for the inconvenience." He produced 2 key cards with a flourish. And of course, a comfortable king room for Mr. Daly right next door. Eleanor, who had remained nearby throughout this exchange, beamed with approval. "The presidential suite has the best view of downtown Dallas," she told George. "And I'll personally make sure it's perfect for you." George shook his head gently. "That's mighty kind, but no need for special treatment. The rooms we booked will be just fine." "I insist," Charles said firmly, "not as special treatment, but as an apology for how you were received." He glared briefly at Trevor before returning his attention to George. "We pride ourselves on Texas hospitality at the Magnolia, and clearly we fell short tonight." By now, word had spread throughout the hotel. The bartender was telling everyone in the lounge about George Strait's presence, and hotel staff began appearing from various doorways, hoping to catch a glimpse of the country music icon. A young bellhop approached hesitantly, clutching a hotel notepad. "Mr. Strait," the young man said nervously, "my grandpa would never forgive me if I didn't at least ask, could I get your autograph? He played your records all through my childhood." George smiled warmly. "Sure thing, son. What's your name?" "Luis, sir, and my grandpa is Miguel." As George signed the notepad with a message to both Luis and his grandfather, more staff members gathered courage and approached with similar requests. Through it all, George responded with genuine kindness, taking time with each person despite his obvious fatigue. Trevor stood by, invisible now except as an object of scorn. He could hear the whispers, see the disgusted looks thrown his way. His colleague Amber, who worked the morning shift at the reception desk, had come downstairs after hearing the commotion and now stared at him with undisguised horror. "You didn't recognize George Strait?" she whispered incredulously. "And you were rude to him? Are you insane?" "I thought he was just some old guy trying to scam a free room," Trevor hissed back defensively. "How was I supposed to know? He's wearing a baseball cap and jeans, for God's sake." "Because you work in Texas now," Amber replied through clenched teeth. "And in Texas, George Strait is basically God. You might as well have insulted Beyoncé. In Houston." Charles finished handling the room arrangements and presented the key cards to George and Mike with a flourish. "Everything is set, gentlemen. Luis will escort you to your rooms and bring up your luggage." As Luis eagerly stepped forward to assist, Charles turned to Trevor with an icy stare. "Mr. Williams, a word in my office. Now." Trevor's career flashed before his eyes as he followed his boss away from the front desk. The murmurs from the lobby followed him like an accusatory chorus. 6 years of working his way up through the hotel industry, from front desk clerk at a budget chain to night manager at one of Dallas's most prestigious hotels, all potentially destroyed in a single interaction. In Charles's office, the general manager closed the door and stood silently for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Trevor stood at attention, his back ramrod straight, awaiting the inevitable. "Do you have any idea?" Charles finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What you've done tonight?" "Sir, George Strait," Charles interrupted, "is not just a country music star. He is an institution in Texas. That man has sold over 100 million records worldwide. He has more #1 hits than any artist in any genre in the history of music. And beyond that, he is known throughout the industry as one of the humblest, most decent human beings you could ever hope to meet." Trevor stared at the carpet, unable to meet his boss's gaze. But even if he weren't famous, Charles continued, his voice rising slightly, even if he were exactly what you apparently thought he was, just some older man in casual clothes, would that justify the way you treated him? Is that how we train our staff to interact with guests at the Magnolia? No, sir, Trevor mumbled. I've received 6 text messages in the last 10 minutes, Charles said, holding up his phone. 2 from board members who were alerted by friends staying in the hotel. 1 from our marketing director, who's already doing damage control because videos of your interaction are already circulating on social media. And 1 from the owner of the hotel himself, who happens to be a personal friend of Mr. Strait. Trevor felt the floor tilt beneath him. His mouth went dry. I should fire you on the spot, Charles stated flatly. Please, Trevor said, finding his voice at last. I made a terrible mistake. I know that. But this job, it's everything to me. I moved across the country for this position. I'll do anything to make this right. Charles studied the young man before him. At 28, Trevor was clearly ambitious, with impressive credentials and recommendations that had landed him this coveted position. But his East Coast bias and cultural blindness had proven to be a liability that the hotel couldn't afford. Here's what's going to happen, Charles finally said. You're going to return to the lobby and apologize to Mr. Strait, publicly. The same way you humiliated him. Then you're suspended without pay for 2 weeks while I decide whether there's any way to salvage your position here. Trevor nodded miserably. It was better than being fired outright, though the public apology would be excruciating. And, Trevor, Charles added, as they walked back toward the door, if you do keep your job, you'll be spending your first week back working with Eleanor in housekeeping. Perhaps she can teach you something about recognizing the humanity in everyone who walks through those doors, famous or not. Back in the lobby, the excitement had somewhat subsided. Most guests had returned to their rooms or the bar, though a few lingered, hoping for another glimpse of the country star. George and Mike were nowhere to be seen, presumably having been escorted to their rooms by Luis. Eleanor was supervising the preparation of the presidential suite, ensuring everything was perfect for their unexpected celebrity guest. She directed the staff with the authority of someone who took immense pride in her work, demanding perfection in every detail, from the arrangement of fresh flowers to the temperature of the room. He likes it cooler than most, she instructed a young housekeeper. Country boys used to sleeping with the windows open, you know, and make sure there's extra coffee for the morning, the good kind, not the regular room packets. When asked how she knew George's preferences, Eleanor simply smiled. 40 years of listening to his interviews. When you love someone's music like I do, you pay attention to the little things they mention. Meanwhile, in the presidential suite, George sat on the edge of the enormous bed, removing his boots with a sigh of relief. The room was indeed impressive. 1,200 square feet of luxury, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Dallas skyline. The lights of the city twinkled beyond the rain-streaked glass, a constellation of human activity spread out below. Mike whistled as he explored the adjoining room. Not bad for a couple of country boys, he called out. Though I bet you never imagined luxury like this back when we were playing those dive bars in San Marcos, George chuckled. Sure didn't. Norma would love this place, though. Shame she couldn't make it. His wife of nearly 50 years had stayed home to care for their newest grandchild, allowing their daughter-in-law a much-needed break. Family had always come first for George, even at the height of his fame. What do you make of that, Trevor? Fella, Mike asked, returning to the main room and sinking into a plush armchair. George considered the question as he rubbed his sore feet. Young man with a lot to learn, he finally said. Reminds me a bit of those Nashville executives when we were starting out, so concerned with appearances they can't see what's real. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. George glanced at Mike, who shrugged and went to answer it. Standing in the hallway was Charles Harrington, with a visibly uncomfortable Trevor Williams beside him. "I apologize for disturbing you, Mr. Strait," Charles said formally, "but Mr. Williams has something he'd like to say to you." George stood and approached the door, his stockinged feet silent on the plush carpet. He looked at Trevor with a neutral expression, neither condemning nor forgiving. Trevor's face was a mask of misery and embarrassment. He cleared his throat twice before managing to speak. "Mr. Strait," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want to apologize for my behavior downstairs. The way I treated you was inexcusable. I was rude, disrespectful, and I'm deeply sorry." George studied the young man, noting the genuine distress in his eyes. Before he could respond, Trevor continued, the words tumbling out faster now. "I grew up in New York City," he said. Country music wasn't part of my life. But that's no excuse for how I acted. I judged you based on your appearance, and I was completely wrong. I probably cost myself my job, and I deserve that. But I needed you to know how truly sorry I am." The hall fell silent as Trevor finished speaking. Charles looked between the two men, while Mike watched from just inside the doorway. For a moment, no one moved. Then, something unexpected happened, something that would later become the centerpiece of a story that would spread across Texas and beyond. George Strait looked at the young hotel manager standing before him, shoulders slumped in defeat, eyes cast down in shame. In that moment, George saw not just a hospitality professional who had made a terrible mistake, but a young man at a crossroads. The kind of crossroads George himself had faced many times throughout his long career. "Why don't you come in for a minute, son?" George said, stepping aside and gesturing into the suite. Charles Harrington's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Mr. Strait, you're under no obligation to—" "I know that," George interrupted gently, "but I'd like to speak with Trevor privately if that's all right with you." The general manager hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "Of course. Whatever you prefer." He turned to Trevor and added in a low voice, "Remember, this is an opportunity you don't deserve." As Trevor cautiously stepped into the presidential suite, George turned to Mike. "Why don't you go check out your room, Mike? Trevor and I are going to have a little chat." Mike gave his longtime friend a knowing look. He'd witnessed George's capacity for forgiveness many times over their 4 decades together. "Sure thing. I could use a shower anyway." He grabbed his bag and nodded to Charles before heading to his adjacent room. George closed the door and gestured toward the sitting area of the suite. "Have a seat." Trevor perched nervously on the edge of an elegant armchair, looking like a man awaiting sentencing. George settled into the sofa across from him, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. For a long moment, he simply observed the young man, taking in his expensive suit, his meticulously styled hair, his designer glasses, all the trappings of someone desperate to project success and sophistication. "How long you been in Dallas?" George finally asked. Trevor blinked in surprise at the unexpected question. 3 months, sir." "And before that? New York, was it?" "Yes, sir. Born and raised in Manhattan." George nodded thoughtfully. "That's quite a change. What brought you to Texas?" Trevor seemed confused by the direction of the conversation, but answered anyway. "The opportunity at the Magnolia. It's a prestigious position, and Dallas is becoming a major hospitality market." He swallowed hard. "At least, it was an opportunity until I ruined it tonight." "You know," George said, leaning back slightly, "my first time playing in New York. City was back in '82, small venue in Manhattan. I was nervous as could be, felt like a fish out of water with my boots and hat." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth at the memory. "Crowd didn't know what to make of me at first. This was before country was mainstream, you understand. Some folks actually laughed when I walked out on stage." Trevor looked up, meeting George's eyes for the first time since entering the suite. "But I just played my music," George continued. By the third song, they stopped seeing the hat and started hearing the stories in the songs. By the end of the night, we had Manhattan lawyers and business folks two-stepping in the aisles. He leaned forward again, his expression serious. The point is, Trevor, we all make judgments based on what's familiar to us. What happened downstairs? That wasn't just about you not recognizing a famous person. It was about something deeper. Trevor nodded slowly. I judged you based on your appearance. I assumed because you were dressed casually and spoke with a country accent that you couldn't possibly belong in a luxury hotel. His voice grew quieter. My parents raised me to believe that success looked a certain way, sounded a certain way. I've spent my whole life trying to fit that image. And how's that working out for you? George asked, without a trace of sarcasm. Trevor gave a humorless laugh. Well, considering I just publicly humiliated one of the biggest music stars in America and am about to lose my job. Not great. George was silent for a moment, considering his next words carefully. You know, in all my years in the music business, I've met all kinds of people. Some of the wealthiest folks I know wear jeans and drive pickup trucks, and some of the poorest souls are dressed in $1,000 suits, desperate for everyone to think they're important. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Dallas skyline. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city glistening under the night sky. I've been lucky enough to have success, George continued, but before the hit records and the tours, I was just a young man from a small town in Texas, worked as a cattle rancher, married my high school sweetheart. Even when the music started taking off, I never wanted to be treated differently. Trevor listened intently, beginning to understand that this conversation was about far more than an apology for failing to recognize a celebrity. The way I see it, George said, turning back to face the young manager, you've got a choice to make now. You can let this mistake define you, or you can learn from it. Not just about recognizing famous faces. That's not the real lesson here. What is the real lesson? Trevor asked quietly. That every person who walks through those doors downstairs deserves respect, George replied simply. Famous or not, whether they're wearing a designer suit or worn-out jeans. He smiled slightly, kind of like what Eleanor seems to understand. The mention of the housekeeper's name made Trevor wince with guilt. She knew who you were immediately. Because she looked at me as a person first, not just as a customer to be judged, George said. That woman has probably cleaned thousands of rooms, dealt with all kinds of people, but she still manages to see the humanity in folks. He shook his head admiringly. That's a gift. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. George crossed the room and opened it to find Eleanor herself, carrying a tray with a pot of coffee and a plate of cookies. I hope I'm not disturbing you, Mr. Strait, she said warmly. But I thought you might like some coffee after your long evening. These are my homemade pecan sandies, an old family recipe. George smiled broadly. That's mighty thoughtful of you, Eleanor. Please come in. Eleanor entered the suite, then stopped short when she saw Trevor sitting there. Her expression cooled noticeably. I didn't realize you had company, she said, her tone suggesting that company wasn't the word she really wanted to use for Trevor. It's all right, George assured her, taking the tray and placing it on the coffee table. Trevor and I were just having a conversation about first impressions. Eleanor gave Trevor a long look that somehow managed to convey both disappointment and hope for redemption. In her 3 decades at the hotel, she had seen many young managers come and go, some learning from their mistakes, others too proud to change. Well, I'll leave you to it then, she said, turning to go. But Mr. Strait, if you need anything at all during your stay, you just dial 0 and ask for Eleanor directly. I appreciate that, George replied sincerely. And thank you for the cookies. My grandmother used to make pecan sandies. These bring back memories. Eleanor beamed at this before departing, closing the door softly behind her. George poured 2 cups of coffee, offering one to Trevor, who accepted it with surprise. "She might not be too fond of me right now," George said, gesturing toward the door where Eleanor had just left, "but she still brought 2 cups. That tells you something about her character." Trevor stared into his coffee, the gravity of the entire situation washing over him anew. "I don't deserve her kindness, or yours." George took a bite of cookie before answering. "Deserve's got nothing to do with it. Kindness isn't something you earn. It's something you give freely, especially when it's hard." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant hum of the city below and the occasional clink of coffee cups against saucers. "So, what happens now?" Trevor finally asked. "With your stay here, I mean. I understand if you want to find different accommodations after how you were treated." George shook his head. "I'm not going anywhere. That would just create more problems for the hotel and the staff, most of whom did nothing wrong." He took another sip of coffee. "Besides, these are some mighty fine cookies." Trevor managed a small smile. The first since the incident in the lobby. "They are good," he agreed, taking a bite of his own cookie. "As for you," George continued, "that's between you and your management. But if you'd like my advice, I'd suggest you take whatever consequence comes your way, learn from it, and move forward." "Mr. Harrington mentioned having me work with Eleanor in housekeeping for a week," Trevor admitted. "If I still have a job at all, might be the best education you could get," George replied. "Eleanor strikes me as someone who has wisdom to share, if you're humble enough to listen." Trevor nodded slowly, considering this perspective. The idea of a Yale Business School graduate pushing a housekeeping cart would have mortified him just hours earlier. Now it seemed like an opportunity he didn't deserve, but desperately needed. "Thank you," he said finally, "not just for talking to me like this, but for not demanding I be fired on the spot. You would have been within your rights." George stood, signaling that their conversation was drawing to a close. "In my experience, demanding someone's job rarely solves anything. People make mistakes. Lord knows I've made plenty." His expression grew more serious. "The real test is what you do next." Meanwhile, downstairs in the hotel lobby, the evening's events had sparked a flurry of activity. Videos of Trevor's confrontation with George and the subsequent recognition by Eleanor had already begun circulating on social media. Hotel guests who had witnessed the scene were posting their accounts, many expressing outrage at how the country star had been treated. Sarah Chen, the hotel's public relations director, had been called in from home and was now huddled with Charles Harrington in his office, assessing the damage. "It's spreading fast," she reported, scrolling through her tablet. "There's already a hashtag trending locally, Respect the King." She looked up at Charles with concern. "And the comments aren't kind to Trevor or the hotel." Charles rubbed his temples, feeling a stress headache forming. "What's our exposure here?" "Hard to say," Sarah replied. "On one hand, yes, it's bad. Press about how we treated a beloved Texas icon. On the other hand, the videos also show Eleanor recognizing him and how quickly we tried to make it right." She continued scrolling through social media posts. "Actually, there's something interesting happening. Some people are defending Trevor, saying he's from New York and couldn't be expected to recognize George Strait out of context. Others are using it as an example of coastal elitism versus Texas values." She grimaced. "It's becoming somewhat political." Charles groaned. "That's the last thing we need." A knock at the office door interrupted them. Julie Martinez, the hotel's night auditor, poked her head in. "Sorry to disturb you," she said, "but I thought you should know the phones are ringing off the hook. We've had calls from 3 different news outlets asking for comments about the George Strait incident, and the reservation line is suddenly swamped with people trying to book rooms." Charles and Sarah exchanged bewildered looks. "People are trying to book rooms because of this?" Charles asked. Julie nodded. Several callers specifically mentioned wanting to stay in the same hotel as George Strait, and a few mentioned Eleanor by name, asking if she would be working during their stay. As this unexpected development sank in, Charles's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and sat up straighter. "It's from Mr. Holloway," he said, referring to the hotel's owner. "He wants an update on the situation and—" Charles paused, reading further. "He says George just called him personally." Sarah and Julie both leaned forward anxiously. "And?" Sarah prompted, and Charles continued slowly. "Apparently, George assured him that he's being treated well now and doesn't want any staff member to lose their job over a simple misunderstanding." The 3 hotel employees looked at each other in astonishment. Julie was the first to speak. "That's incredibly gracious of him." Sarah shook her head in wonder. "You know, there's a reason they call him the gentleman of country music. This just proves it." Back in his suite, George had just escorted Trevor to the door. As they shook hands, George offered one final piece of advice. "Tomorrow's going to be tough," he said frankly. "Once those videos spread, there'll be people calling for your head. Some folks love nothing more than watching someone else's public fall from grace." Trevor nodded grimly. "I know. But remember this," George continued. "How people react to your mistake is about them. How you respond to it, that's about you. And that's the only part you can control." After Trevor left, George finally allowed himself to feel the exhaustion of the long day. He sat heavily on the edge of the king-sized bed, his bones aching from the hours of performing and the emotional aftermath at the hotel. He thought about calling Norma, but decided it could wait until morning. No need to worry her with this business so late at night. Instead, he picked up one of Eleanor's cookies and smiled to himself. Despite everything, there was something comforting about being recognized not for his fame, but for his humanity. Eleanor had seen past the worn jeans and baseball cap to the person underneath, not just the celebrity, but the man. As George prepared for bed, the story of what had happened at the Hotel Magnolia was already spreading across Dallas and beyond. By morning, it would reach much further, though not in the way anyone might have expected. Outside the hotel, a young woman who had been in the lobby during the confrontation was uploading the video she'd captured to multiple social media platforms. Melissa Kramer, a marketing executive attending the technology conference, had filmed nearly the entire exchange, from Trevor's initial dismissive treatment to Eleanor's warm recognition. "You won't believe what I just witnessed," she typed as a caption. "George Strait humiliated by hotel staff who didn't recognize him. Then this happens." She added several hashtags. "Ja George Strait, Yo Hotel, Drama, Ga Texas, Country Music." As she hit post, Melissa had no idea that her video would be viewed over 2 million times by morning, or that it would spark a conversation about fame, humility, and snap judgments that would extend far beyond the country music community. In her small apartment across town, Eleanor Thompson was recounting the evening's events to her daughter over the phone. "I still can't believe it," she said excitedly. "George Strait himself standing right there in our lobby, and that boy Trevor treating him like he was nobody." She clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Young people these days, they think if you're not dressed fancy, you must not be important." "Did Mr. Strait seem angry?" her daughter asked. Eleanor considered this. "That's the thing. He didn't. He was just dignified. Stood there taking that disrespect without raising his voice or making a scene." Her voice filled with admiration. "That's how you can tell true class. It's not about fancy clothes or important titles. It's about how you treat people, especially when things aren't going your way." As Eleanor continued describing her brief interaction with the country star, she couldn't know that by this time tomorrow, her own life would be changed as well. The spotlight that was about to shine on the Hotel Magnolia would illuminate not just George Strait's gracious response to humiliation, but also the wisdom and warmth of a housekeeper who had recognized the true measure of a man when others had failed to see it. The night settled over Dallas, rain clouds finally giving way to reveal a scattering of stars above the city lights. In various rooms throughout the Hotel Magnolia, people drifted to sleep with different versions of the evening's events playing through their minds. But for George Strait, Trevor Williams, and Eleanor Thompson, the most significant chapters of this unexpected story were yet to come. The morning sun streamed through the large windows of the presidential suite, casting warm patches of light across the plush carpet. George Strait stood at the window, a cup of coffee in hand, watching Dallas come alive below. He'd been up since 5. Old ranching habits died hard, even on the road. In his other hand, he held his phone, scrolling through a series of increasingly urgent text messages from his manager, Irv Woolsey. "You seen the video?" read the latest message. "It's everywhere. Already had calls from Good Morning America, Today Show, and every country music station in America. How do you want to handle this?" George sighed and set the phone down without replying. In his 40 years in the spotlight, he had carefully guarded his privacy, giving relatively few interviews and letting his music speak for itself. The idea that a simple hotel check-in had somehow become national news felt like an unwelcome intrusion into the quiet life he preferred when not on stage. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Opening it, he found Mike Daly already dressed for the day, his weathered face creased with concern. "Morning, George. Guessing you've seen what's happening?" George nodded, stepping aside to let his friend enter. "Irv's blowing up my phone. Apparently we're trending, whatever that means." Mike chuckled despite the situation. "It means my grandkids are suddenly impressed with their old grandpa. My daughter says they're telling all their friends they know. The guy in the hotel video." His expression grew more serious. "What are you thinking? How do you want to play this?" George returned to the window, gazing thoughtfully at the city skyline. "Not sure there's much to play. It was a misunderstanding, plain and simple. A misunderstanding that's got about 3 million views already," Mike pointed out. "People are pretty fired up about how that manager treated you." George turned from the window. "Trevor," he said firmly. "His name is Trevor, and he's a young man who made a mistake." Mike studied his longtime friend with a knowing look. In the 4 decades they'd played music together, through all the highs and lows, he'd come to recognize the quiet determination in George's eyes. It was the same look he'd had back in 1981, when they'd driven all night to make a gig after their bus broke down, or in 1986, when he'd insisted on continuing a tour despite a raging case of the flu. But Mike had seen it most powerfully in 1986, after George's 13-year-old daughter Jennifer was killed in a car accident. In the depths of unimaginable grief, George had somehow found the strength not only to carry on, but to channel his pain into his music and his charitable foundation. That quiet dignity in the face of life's cruelest blow had earned Mike's eternal respect. "So, what's the plan?" Mike asked simply, knowing George would have given the situation careful thought. "I think I need to make a statement," George replied, somewhat reluctantly. "Not for my sake, but for Trevor's and the hotel's. This thing's getting out of hand." Before Mike could respond, George's phone rang. The screen displayed Charles Harrington, hotel manager. "Mr. Strait," Charles began. When George answered, his voice strained with professional courtesy overlaying obvious stress. "I cannot apologize enough for the continuing disruption to your stay. There's quite a situation developing in the lobby." "What kind of situation?" George asked. "It seems word has spread about last night's incident," Charles explained carefully. "We have several news vans outside, a growing crowd of your fans gathering in the street, and our phone lines are completely overwhelmed. We've also had to assign security to Eleanor. Apparently, she's become something of an overnight celebrity herself." George rubbed his forehead. I'm sorry to hear that. Is she okay? She's taking it in stride, actually, Charles said, a note of admiration in his voice. Says she's too old to get flustered by a little attention. But there's something else. He hesitated. Go on, George encouraged. Trevor Williams, Charles continued. He was scheduled for his disciplinary meeting with me this morning, but he hasn't shown up or called in. His roommate said he left their apartment around dawn, looking completely devastated. We're somewhat concerned about his state of mind. George frowned at this news. His conversation with Trevor the previous evening had ended on what he thought was a constructive note. While the young man had clearly been embarrassed and remorseful, he hadn't seemed despondent. I see, George said. That is concerning. Have you tried calling him? Several times. It goes straight to voicemail, Charles replied. Mr. Strait, while we're deeply disturbed by Mr. Williams' behavior toward you, we're also worried about him as a person. Some of the online comments about him are quite harsh. George thought for a moment. I understand. Listen, I'm planning to make a public statement about all this. Maybe that will help settle things down a bit. That would be tremendously appreciated, Charles said with relief. In the meantime, please let us know if there's anything you need. We can arrange for meals to be sent up if you prefer not to come downstairs with all the commotion. After ending the call, George turned to Mike, who had been listening intently. Sounds like a circus down there, Mike commented. And now Trevor's missing, George added with concern. I don't like the sound of that. He picked up his phone again and scrolled through social media, something he rarely did. His daughter-in-law had set up accounts for him years ago, but they were primarily managed by his team. Now he wanted to see firsthand what people were saying. What he found troubled him deeply. While many comments praised his calm demeanor during the confrontation, an equal number viciously attacked Trevor, calling for his firing, mocking his appearance, even making threats. The hotel was receiving one-star reviews by the hundreds from people who had never stayed there, all based on Trevor's treatment of George. This isn't right, George said, setting down the phone with disgust. The punishment doesn't fit the crime here. The boy was rude, not evil. Mike nodded in agreement. People love a pile-on these days. Gives them a chance to feel righteous by tearing someone else down. George paced the room, thinking, I need to find him before he does something foolish. You don't even know where to look, Mike pointed out reasonably. And how would you get through that crowd downstairs without causing even more commotion? George stopped pacing, a determined look settling on his face. I think I know someone who can help. 30 minutes later, Eleanor Thompson knocked quietly on the door of the presidential suite. George welcomed her in, noting that despite the early hour and unexpected attention, she looked poised and professional in her hotel uniform. Thank you for coming up, Eleanor, George said. I hear you've become quite the celebrity yourself this morning. Eleanor chuckled, smoothing her silver hair. Oh, it's silliness, really. My grandson called to tell me I'm internet famous now. She shook her head in bemusement. At my age, fame isn't worth much, unless it comes with a good retirement plan. George smiled at her practical perspective. I was hoping you might be able to help me with something. It's about Trevor Williams. Eleanor's expression grew serious. The poor boy hasn't shown up for his meeting with Mr. Harrington. It's not like him to be unprofessional despite... She paused delicately. Despite his behavior last night, George finished for her. That's what concerns me. People make mistakes, but the online response seems excessive. I'm worried about him and I'd like to find him. Eleanor studied George. He thoughtfully. May I speak frankly, Mr. Strait? I wish you would. You don't owe that young man anything, she said firmly. He treated you disrespectfully in front of dozens of people. Most celebrities in your position would be demanding his termination, not worrying about his welfare. George nodded acknowledgement of her point. You're right. I don't owe him anything, but I've been thinking about something my father told me years ago. He said, George, when you have power over someone else's livelihood, you have a responsibility to use that power justly. Right now, whether I like it or not, I have power over Trevor's future. Eleanor's expression softened. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, George agreed. He also used to say that how you treat people when no one's looking shows your true character. I'd add that how you treat people who've wronged you shows even more. He leaned forward slightly. So do you have any idea where Trevor might have gone? Eleanor hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. He might be at Reverchon Park. He mentioned once that he goes there early mornings when he needs to think, said it reminds him of Central Park back in New York. George thanked her, then outlined his plan to leave the hotel unnoticed. Eleanor listened, then shook her head firmly. You'll never make it through the lobby without being spotted, she said, but there's a service elevator and staff exit that might work better. Follow me. 15 minutes later, George was seated in Eleanor's modest Toyota Corolla. A hotel maintenance cap pulled low over his brow as they drove away from the service entrance. No one had given them a second glance. Hotel staff coming and going was a common sight, even at that hour. I appreciate this, Eleanor, George said as they navigated the morning traffic. You're risking your job helping me sneak out like this. Eleanor kept her eyes on the road but smiled slightly. Mr. Harrington won't say a word once he knows it was to help you. Besides, I've only got 2 years until retirement. What are they going to do? Take away my pension for helping? George Strait? At Reverchon Park, the morning was quiet, with only a few joggers and dog walkers enjoying the green space. George and Eleanor walked along the paths, scanning the benches and open areas for any sign of Trevor. Finally, near a small pond, they spotted a solitary figure seated on a bench, hunched forward with his head in his hands. Even from a distance, George recognized the young hotel manager, though he looked markedly different from the polished professional of the night before. His designer suit was rumpled, his carefully styled hair disheveled, his entire posture one of defeat. "Would you mind waiting here?" George asked Eleanor. "I think I should talk to him alone." Eleanor nodded and found a bench some distance away. George approached Trevor slowly, making sure his footsteps were audible enough not to startle the young man. Still, Trevor jumped when George sat down beside him. His eyes widened in recognition, then quickly filled with fresh shame. "Mr. Strait," he said hoarsely, "how did you find me?" "Had some help," George replied, nodding toward Eleanor in the distance. "People are worried about you, son." Trevor gave a bitter laugh. "Worried? About me? I doubt that. Have you seen what they're saying online?" He held up his phone, which displayed a Twitter thread with thousands of comments, most viciously attacking him. "I've received death threats. Death threats for not recognizing a country singer." George winced. "I'm sorry to hear that. It's completely uncalled for. My parents called this morning," Trevor continued, his voice hollow. "Someone doxed me, published their address and phone number online. They've been getting harassing calls all night." He looked down at his hands. "I was trying to make them proud, you know. First-generation Americans worked so hard to put me through college, and now I'm famous for being that guy who disrespected George Strait." George was silent for a moment, letting the young man's words sink in. The situation had escalated far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. What should have been a minor, if embarrassing, incident had somehow morphed into the kind of internet firestorm that could derail a young person's entire career, even their life. "You know," George finally said, "back in '95, I played a show in Houston. Big venue, sold-out crowd. I was at the height of my career then, lots of #1 hits under my belt." He gazed out at the park, remembering. "There was this young sound engineer, couldn't have been more than 22 or 23. During check yes or no, my microphone cut out completely." Trevor looked up, momentarily distracted from his own troubles. 50,000 people, and suddenly they can't hear me, George continued. The band kept playing, but I'm standing there useless. This went on for almost a full minute, felt like an eternity. Finally, the sound came back, and we finished the show. But afterward, I found that young engineer backstage, crying in a supply closet. He was sure his career was over, that I'd make sure he never worked in the industry again. "What did you do?" Trevor asked quietly. I sat down next to him. "Kind of like I'm doing with you now," George said, and I told him about the time in '83 when I knocked over George Jones's guitar backstage at the Grand Ole Opry. Completely accidental, but it was his favorite Martin, and the neck cracked. I was mortified. A ghost of a smile appeared on Trevor's face. "What happened?" George looked at me. I was just a newcomer then, and he was already a legend. And he said, "Son, if I fired every person who ever made a mistake around me, I'd be standing on that stage all by myself." Then he got that guitar fixed and invited me to open for him on his next tour. George turned to face Trevor directly. "The point is, mistakes happen. It's what comes after that matters." Trevor nodded slowly, seeming to absorb George's words. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, Mr. Strait. Really. But this is different. The internet doesn't forgive. This will follow me forever." "Maybe," George conceded, "or maybe there's a way to change the narrative." He pulled out his own phone. "What would you say to doing a short video with me? Right now, just the two of us talking honestly about what happened and what we've both learned from it." Trevor looked stunned. "You would do that? For me?" "Not just for you," George replied truthfully. "For everyone involved. The hotel staff doesn't deserve the hate they're getting. Your parents don't deserve harassment, and people who are enjoying the pile-on deserve a reminder about grace and forgiveness." He smiled slightly. "Besides, I could use the practice with social media. My grandkids tell me I'm terrible at it." For the first time, Trevor laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even him. "They're not wrong. Your last Twitter post was from 2 years ago announcing a tour date." "See, I need all the help I can get," George said, his eyes crinkling with humor. "So what do you say? Shall we try to put this right together?" As Trevor considered George's offer, Eleanor watched from her distant bench, marveling at the scene before her. In her 32 years at the Hotel Magnolia, she had encountered many celebrities, some kind, others demanding, a few downright awful. But she had never witnessed anything quite like this. A man using his fame not to punish someone who had wronged him, but to lift them up from their lowest moment. What Eleanor couldn't know was that George's compassion stemmed from his own experiences with public judgment. Throughout his career, he had been criticized for everything from his traditional sound when others were going pop, to his reserved personality in an industry that rewarded flamboyance. And in his darkest hour, after his daughter's death, he had faced countless uninformed opinions about how he should grieve, when he should return to performing, how he should honor her memory. He had learned then what really mattered, and it wasn't public opinion or social media approval. It was doing what you believed was right, even when no one was watching, or in this case, when everyone was. Now I'll write the fifth and final section of the story, 2,000 words. This section needs to focus on the transformation part of the structure, showing how Trevor's social media post goes viral, the media's reaction to George Strait's noble attitude, and how the incident changes Trevor's perspective. I should include the hotel offering lifetime free stays to George and Trevor, attending George's next show in Dallas. I'll wrap everything up with an epilogue showing how the incident changed Trevor's perspectives about judging people based on appearances. I'll make sure this section is approximately 2,000 words and provides a satisfying conclusion to the story. The video lasted just under 5 minutes. Filmed on George's phone with the pond as a backdrop, it featured the country music legend sitting side by side with Trevor Williams on the park bench. There were no scripts, no publicists, no carefully crafted statements, just two men talking honestly about a human moment that had somehow captured the nation's attention. "Folks, this is George Strait," he began simply, tipping his borrowed maintenance cap. "You might have seen a video going around about what happened at a hotel last night. I wanted to take a minute to clear some things up, and I've invited the young man at the center of this story to join me. This here is Trevor Williams." Trevor appeared visibly nervous but composed as he introduced himself and briefly explained his role at the hotel. "First off," George continued, "I want to say that everyone at the Hotel Magnolia has been exceptional, from Eleanor the housekeeper to the management team. What happened last night was just a simple misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion." Trevor took a deep breath before speaking. "I failed to recognize Mr. Strait when he arrived at our hotel," he said directly to the camera. "I made assumptions based on his casual appearance, and I was disrespectful in how I handled the situation. It was unprofessional and wrong." "We've all made judgments based on appearances," George added. "I know I have, and Trevor here has apologized sincerely, which I've accepted." The most powerful moment came when Trevor explained how the incident had forced him to confront his own biases. "Growing up in New York City, I had certain ideas about people with southern accents and casual clothing," he admitted. "Last night showed me how wrong and limiting those assumptions were. I judged one of the most successful recording artists in history because he wasn't wearing expensive clothes or acting entitled to special treatment." George concluded with a request that surprised many who watched. "I understand people are upset on my behalf, but I'm asking folks to show Trevor the same grace he's shown in owning his mistake. And maybe we can all take a second look at how quick we are to judge folks we don't know." Eleanor drove them back to the hotel after the recording, the three of them discussing how the video should be shared. Despite his limited social media knowledge, George insisted it be posted on his official accounts without any editing or intervention from his management team. "Better to do it now before this gets any bigger," he said, checking his phone to find 17 missed calls from Irv, his publicist, and various news outlets. As Eleanor pulled into the hotel's service entrance, she offered her own perspective. "You know, in all my years of housekeeping, I've learned you can tell a lot about people by the state they leave their hotel rooms in. Some of the richest guests leave the biggest messes, while folks with less often tidy up before I even arrive." She smiled at Trevor in the rearview mirror. "It's never about the fancy clothes or the big names. It's about how you see other people, as human beings worthy of respect or as something else." Back at the hotel, the situation had escalated during their absence. A crowd of fans had gathered outside, holding signs with messages like "Respect the King" and "Texas loves George." 3 local TV news vans were parked across the street, reporters doing live stand-ups in front of the building. Inside the lobby, Charles Harrington was juggling calls from the hotel's corporate office while attempting to maintain normal operations. The trio slipped in through the service entrance, but word of their return spread quickly among the staff. By the time they reached the main floor, Charles was hurrying toward them, relief evident on his face. "Mr. Strait, thank God you're back," he said. "And Trevor, we've been worried sick." His expression hardened slightly as he addressed the young manager. "Though we still need to have our discussion about last night." "I understand, sir," Trevor replied. "I'm ready to accept whatever consequences you decide are appropriate." George stepped forward. "Before you make any decisions, Charles, I'd appreciate if you'd watch something." He held up his phone, showing the video that was now uploading to his social media accounts. "Trevor and I have had a good talk, and I think we've both learned something from this experience." In the hotel owner's suite on the top floor, they gathered around a laptop to watch the video, George, Trevor, Eleanor, Charles, and hotel owner Robert Holloway, a longtime Texas businessman who had flown in from Houston upon hearing about the incident. The room was silent as the 5-minute conversation played, each person absorbing the simple but powerful message it contained. When it ended, Robert Holloway was the first to speak. "George, I've known you for 30 years, and you never cease to amaze me. Most people would have used their celebrity to demand heads on platters. Instead, you turned this into a teaching moment." Charles nodded in agreement, then turned to Trevor. "While I appreciate Mr. Strait's gracious attitude, there are still professional standards that were violated last night." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "However, your willingness to admit your mistakes publicly and learn from them demonstrates character that aligns with our values. Instead of termination, I'm assigning you to work with Eleanor for the next 2 weeks, learning every aspect of hotel operations from the ground up." Trevor's relief was palpable. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." "Don't thank me," Charles replied. "Thank Mr. Strait and Eleanor." Within an hour of posting, the video had already garnered over 100,000 views. By midday, it had reached 1 million and was being picked up by national news outlets. The narrative had shifted dramatically. What had started as a story about a celebrity being disrespected had transformed into a powerful message about judgment, forgiveness, and learning from mistakes. George's phone wouldn't stop ringing, and calls from fellow country artists, TV shows wanting interviews, even the governor of Texas. He ignored most of them, preferring to focus on the real purpose of his Dallas trip, the benefit concert for flood victims. "All this attention could do some good," Mike suggested when they met for lunch in George's suite. "Why not use it to remind people about the flood relief effort? That's why we came to Dallas in the first place." George considered this. "Not a bad idea. There are still families who lost everything in those floods." That afternoon, George released a second, shorter video. Standing in front of the Hotel Magnolia with Trevor and Eleanor flanking him, he thanked people for their supportive messages but redirected attention to the ongoing need for flood relief donations. He mentioned the Texas Flood Relief Fund by name and provided information on how to contribute. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, the relief fund received over $2 million in new donations, 10 times what the benefit concert had raised. News outlets that had been covering the hotel incident now shifted to highlighting the flood victims' stories and recovery efforts. For his part, Trevor Williams began his first day under Eleanor's supervision with a mix of trepidation and humility. She proved to be a demanding but fair mentor, showing him aspects of hotel operations he had never considered important before. "See these sheets?" she asked him as they changed beds together. "They tell a story about who slept here. The businessman who tosses and turns all night, worried about his meeting. The mother who lets her children jump on the bed, creating those little indentations of joy. The elderly couple who only disturb one side of the bed because they still sleep curled together after 50 years. Trevor had never thought about hotel rooms this way, as spaces that held human stories rather than just inventory to be managed. As the days passed, he found himself increasingly drawn into Eleanor's perspective on hospitality. "It's not about luxury or status," she told him, while teaching him the proper way to clean a bathroom. "It's about making people feel respected and comfortable, no matter who they are or where they come from." By the end of his first week under Eleanor's guidance, Trevor had cleaned toilets, carried luggage, served room service meals, and assisted with maintenance calls. His designer suit stayed in the closet, replaced by practical uniform clothing. His carefully styled hair became less important than comfortable shoes that could withstand 8 hours of constant walking. Most importantly, he began to see the hotel and its guests differently. He noticed how some of the wealthiest visitors treated staff with indifference or outright disrespect, while others, often those in more modest rooms, took time to learn employees' names and thank them for their service. Meanwhile, the story of George Strait and the night manager continued to resonate across the country. Memes, parodies, and thoughtful essays proliferated online. Morning shows devoted segments to discussions about judgment and forgiveness. Country radio stations played George's music in heavy rotation, often paired with stories from DJs and listeners, about times they had misjudged others or been misjudged themselves. On George's last day in Dallas, Robert Holloway hosted a private dinner in the hotel's executive dining room. The guest list was small: George and Mike, Trevor and Eleanor, Charles and Robert himself. The conversation flowed easily, with none of the awkwardness that might have been expected, given how they had all come together. As dessert was served, Robert raised his glass in a toast. "To new friendships formed in unlikely circumstances," he said, "and to George, whose character in private matched exactly what his fans have always believed about him in public." George, never comfortable being the center of attention off stage, deflected the praise. "I just did what seemed right at the time. It's Trevor and Eleanor here who deserve credit for being willing to learn from each other." Eleanor beamed at the recognition, while Trevor nodded thoughtfully. The young manager had undergone a visible transformation over the past few days. Not just in his appearance, which was less polished and more authentic, but in his demeanor, which had softened considerably. At the end of the evening, Robert presented George with a framed letter. "The Hotel Magnolia would be honored if you would accept a lifetime of complimentary stays at any of our properties worldwide," he said. "Not because you're George Strait, but because you showed us what true Texas hospitality should look like." George accepted the frame with gratitude, but typical modesty. "That's mighty generous, though I hope the next time I check in, there's a little less excitement involved." As the dinner concluded, Trevor approached George privately. "Mr. Strait, there's something I'd like to ask you," he said. "That invitation to your next Dallas concert, does it still stand?" "Of course it does," George replied warmly. "And bring Eleanor too, if she's willing. I'd like to have you both as my guests." 3 months later, Trevor Williams stood backstage at the American Airlines Center in Dallas, hardly believing where he found himself. Beside him, Eleanor was practically vibrating with excitement, dressed in her Sunday best for the occasion. They watched in awe as George Strait performed for a sold-out crowd of 20,000 fans, his voice as strong and clear as it had been decades earlier. The past few months had changed Trevor's life in ways he never could have imagined. His 2 weeks under Eleanor's supervision had turned into a genuine friendship and ongoing mentorship. When Charles Harrington offered to restore him to his night manager position, Trevor had surprised everyone, himself included, by requesting to remain in a mixed role that included regular shifts with the housekeeping and maintenance teams. "I can be a better manager if I truly understand every aspect of the hotel's operations," he had explained. The video of George and Trevor's park bench conversation had become a case study in crisis management courses at several universities, including Trevor's alma mater. He had been invited to speak to hospitality students about his experience, sharing the lessons he had learned about humility, respect, and the danger of snap judgments. As George finished Amarillo by morning, Eleanor's late husband's favorite, Trevor reflected on how differently things might have gone. If George had reacted with anger instead of grace, if Eleanor hadn't recognized the country star, if the online outrage had been allowed to run its course unchecked, his career and possibly his life would have taken a much darker path. When the concert ended and they joined George in his dressing room, Trevor finally asked the question that had been on his mind for months. "Why did you do it?" he asked simply. You could have let me get fired, let me become another internet cautionary tale. Why did you go out of your way to help someone who had disrespected you? George considered the question as he carefully placed his guitar in its case. You know, my father used to say that a man's character isn't defined by how he treats people who can help him, but by how he treats those who can't. He looked up with a small smile. Besides, we've all needed second chances at some point. Before they left, Eleanor presented George with a small gift, a tin of her homemade pecan sandies, the cookies she'd brought to his room that first night. "For the road," she said with a warm smile. "My husband always said music feeds the soul, but cookies feed the heart." Days later, as George Strait's tour bus rolled toward its next destination, he shared Eleanor's cookies with the band members. Mike Daly, biting into one with appreciation, remarked, "You know, that whole hotel situation could have been a real disaster. Turned out to be something pretty special instead." George nodded in agreement, watching the Texas landscape roll by outside the window. In a career spanning 4 decades, he had accumulated countless awards, chart-topping hits, and memories from performances around the world. Yet sometimes it was the unexpected moments, like a rainy night at a Dallas hotel, that reminded him why music had always been about more than fame or fortune. At its heart, it was about connecting with people, about shared humanity and the stories that bind us together across all differences. Back at the Hotel Magnolia, Trevor Williams welcomed an elderly couple at the check-in desk. They were simply dressed, a bit travel-worn, after a long drive from Oklahoma to visit their new grandchild in Dallas. In the past, he might have assigned them a standard room with minimal interaction. Now, he listened attentively as they shared their excitement about meeting their granddaughter for the first time. "I think we might have a corner room available on our top floor," he told them with a genuine smile. "It has a lovely view of the sunset, and I believe we can arrange a small basket of baby-themed cookies from our kitchen to help you celebrate becoming grandparents." As he completed their check-in, Trevor noticed Eleanor passing through the lobby with her housekeeping cart. They exchanged smiles of understanding, both forever changed by a chance encounter with George Strait, the country music legend whose greatest legacy might not be his music at all, but the quiet dignity with which he moved through the world, changing lives one interaction at a time.